The underlying movement principle that explains the difference between hand speed and racket speed, which is what we discussed in our first movement map lesson, is the kinetic chain. When scientists attach electronic sensors to the different segments of the kinetic chain, they can measure the speed of each segment. This is called the kinematic sequence, measuring the speed of each segment of the body. And typically, as you see here, they only measure 4 or 5 segments of the kinetic chain, creating a simplified look scientific measurement term of revolutions per second into miles per hour, which is our everyday understanding of how we measure and understand speed. What you see here from the bottom to the top is the speed of the pelvis at the bottom going from 5 miles an hour or less. Then the next segment up the kinetic chain in this graph is the hand speed in purple, going less than 20 miles per hour. But it's the great speed up in the last whip segment, where the graph with the red line shows the racket head speed going up to 90 miles an hour. This is the speed up factor of the whip effect in the swing. I call this depiction the Kinetic Whip windup, and I borrowed the concept from Peter Cowan, who I referred to earlier, as some people think he's the world's greatest golf instructor. He's very good, no doubt about that. Well, his depiction of this type of windup in golf, he called the spiral staircase, because basically we're coiling and winding from the ground up, each segment turning back and rotating, coiling, even into the arms, hands, and the racket all end up in a long spiraling coil up position. The spiral lines of our muscle system establish the foundation for rotational and spiraling movements. The elastic web-like fascia material found throughout our body provides the foundation for springy, whippy, and wave-like movements. In sum, the human body is built for rotation. And as you can see, the different segments of the human body have different ranges of rotational movement. With the ankles being fairly stiff and solid, their rotational range is only 10 to 20 degrees. As we move up the kinetic chain, we typically have more range of motion, with the shoulder segment having the largest range of motion in the human body. The flexibility and rotational capability of the shoulder in throwing and swinging sports is critical, and we'll be discussing this over the course of these lessons on the Kinetic Whip. You'll recall in our earlier lessons where we talked about the wax off and the wax on movements, tried to keep it simple. Now we're moving into a more complex understanding of the swing. So after we get our wax off movement, our coil up here, maybe like Djokovic, where we're somewhat wound up, then we talked about a transition move. Well, the transition move starts as the arms are reaching their upper extent in this wind-up. The lower half of our body is going to start to unwind and rotate. That's the beginning of the transition movement. So what we don't want is everything to rotate as this one piece. Then our racket head is only moving as fast as our hand in a uniform way. We're not going to get any speed. So we're separating out these segments. So as the lower half starts to unwind and maybe the non-hitting arm starts to pull more, we have one last loading in the upper shoulder complex, which is very flexible, and in the upper torso. So we wind back even further against our hips as they start to initiate their turn, and we have a sinking as well. So we're lowering our center of mass and gathering energy in our lower body and in our upper body in this last transition move, and we'll go through these steps subsequently now. Of course, in this take back, our shoulder joint is externally rotating, and we're pulling and stretching back against our lower body, which is starting to initiate the turn back, but our back is still pulling back and stretching everything up here. This next slide is trying to show you more of the rotational nature of the whip complex, if you will, that we create with our body and our arms and our racket. So we have multiple segments in our whip form. We have our shoulder joint, we have our elbow joint, we have our wrist joint, we have our finger joints. All of these are different segments, and then of course we have the racket itself. So as this whip structure is dropping, remember we're going to talk about dropping, tapping the dog on the head, and we're creating this form. We're creating a whip form with multiple segments. And as we get into the slot and start to deliver this whip form and let it unwind and uncoil, again, one of the last segments at the turn is going to be this center of mass segment in the racket throat itself that's going to help generate this rotational throw around the edge, blazing fast movement that we've talked about. So we move through 2 of the 3 phases of the swing in this last few moments. So we have had the wind up and coiling, the spiral coiling up of our body and our arm structure and our shoulders and even the racket form. We've had the handbrake, the transition of the drop and into some sort of slotted position. Now you can see in the Djokovic photo here, the slot position can vary. You know, if you have a high ball, low ball, it depends. He has a very high ball here, and maybe he doesn't have enough time to do a full coil back with the tip of the racket pointing to the side back fence. He's more up here on a high ball, racket tip pointed straight back. It doesn't matter. It depends on the ball you're receiving and what your action is going to be towards the opponent. Now we're in the acceleration phase, which is the forward delivery of the racket from a slotted position, whether the slot's high or back here down low. We're talking about now moving the racket around the swing circle. And here we have the very critical moment of danger for most players. And I talked about this with Coco Gauff's flaw in her topspin forehand, where she has a very high take back, not much of a transition to any slotted position. And then she fires the shoulders and the arms aggressively around the swing circle with the racket head coming out immediately. And then all of a sudden, it's just an arm swing, and it's a very uncertain arm swing at that. So we don't want a load and explode mentality at the beginning of our swing, the acceleration phase, that is. Instead, we want to allow the sequence of unwinding of the body and to continue. So if we were in a lower slot and we've already dropped down into our transition move and now we're moving out of that, the lower body, which has sort of started to unwind a little bit in the transition, now is really going to start to drive up with the back trail leg firing around the circle. Really powerful, aggressive move, more with the lower body. And the upper body, once the hips have started to turn and then they start to slow down, just like in the kinetic chain, then the upper torso and the chest start to follow in a faster rotation. And that faster rotation, as the chest starts to slow down, then that energy is passed to the shoulder complex here. And the shoulder area starts to accelerate around the rotational path, followed by the arm and racket, of course. So once again, the danger in this first part of the acceleration phase is for the player to overexert the hitting shoulder too soon and too fast, load and explode. We want to let this sequencing of the body, the kinetic chain from the lower body, the upper body, shoulder, energy flows into the shoulder relatively passively, and it's still building up energy, and now we're here at the turn with still all the stored energy in our shoulder and our arm complex. In this next part of the acceleration phase, as you can see, we're further along in the process. You can see that Djokovic's hips have already rotated and are now stopping their rotation. They're facing forward. And the chest, again, the kinetic chain passes the momentum and flow of the movement up the chain to the chest, has rotated after the hips have stopped. And now we're at the point where the chest is slowing down and the energy is passing, into the hitting arm and into the hitting shoulder. And you see this kind of position where we're basically have wound up the rubber band. So the non-hitting arm out here has been, and back, are pulling around the circle, adding this pull. The chest is stretched open and stretched into the hitting arm and complex. So creating this large energy stretch across the body. We talked about the fascia and musculature of the body. So this is like the rubber band at this point, waiting to be snapped. Or it's going to be the crack of the whip, or the release of all the stored up tension and coil into this final snapping and incredibly fast speed around the swing circle. In this last part of the acceleration phase, we're actually moving into contact and follow through. Remember, the basics is that we've come from a slotted position here, wherever it is. We've been driving the elbow forward with the racket lagging. We've reached the turn, and now the body has started to slow down. The non-hitting arm has, as we approach contact, has stopped the non-hitting side, which then creates more snapping around rotational energy in the hitting side. But we're still moving the racket on edge in this windshield wiper form. And you can see this right at the moment of contact. Again, hand is ahead of the racket. Racket head is below and behind the hand. And as we come into contact, we can use our right side pressing into the ball just momentarily as it passes, so we're getting stability with the racket, and compression and spin on the ball as it passes through this windshield wiper form. We're not pushing out literally like this or extending the racket towards the target like this. We're keeping on this beautiful arcing path and letting it release effortlessly.